Very urgent. Your soulmate is Aboutto. Give up on you forever. Open Thisbefore. It's Toolate. Something made your soulmate stop with their hand hovering over the final message they had been trying to write for nearly an hour. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic outside, yet inside their mind, everything felt unbearably loud. They typed your name. Deleted it. Typed it again. Then they stared at the empty space beneath it as though a few sentences could somehow decide the future between you. But here is the detail that changes everything: they weren't trying to write an angry goodbye. They were trying to explain why they felt they had no strength left to keep waiting. Stay close to this moment, because what pushed them toward giving up wasn't a lack of feeling. It was the exact opposite. They had been carrying feelings for you so deeply, for so long, that silence had started becoming its own answer. And tonight, one question kept returning to them: what if you never knew how close they came to choosing you completely? Their eyes moved toward an old conversation on their phone. One message from you was still there. A simple line. Nothing dramatic. Yet they read it again and whispered, almost involuntarily, "Maybe I misunderstood everything." And suddenly, the goodbye they had been preparing became much harder to send. Then something even more unexpected happened. Your soulmate stood up, walked toward the window, and placed the phone face down behind them. They had made themselves a promise earlier that evening: no more checking, no more searching for hidden meaning, no more wondering whether tomorrow would finally bring the conversation they had been hoping for. They wanted certainty. But as they looked through the glass at headlights moving along the street below, one memory interrupted that decision. It wasn't a grand romantic moment. It was something smaller: the way you once responded when they were uncertain, the way your words had made them feel understood without needing a long explanation. Why would that memory return now, at the exact moment they were preparing to walk away? They tried dismissing it, but another memory followed. Then another. Suddenly, this wasn't about whether they still cared. That answer was obvious. The real question was whether they had been judging your silence without understanding what might have been happening on your side. Don't move past that detail too quickly. Because moments before they planned to close this chapter forever, your soulmate realized there was one conversation the two of you had never actually finished. And if that conversation meant what they now suspected it meant, everything they were about to do could be based on the wrong conclusion. Their phone lit up behind them. For one sharp second, they froze. They didn't turn around immediately. Their expression changed first. The guarded look disappeared, replaced by something almost hopeful. Was it you? Was this finally the message they had quietly imagined receiving? They reached for the phone, but what appeared on the screen wasn't what they expected. It was something that brought them back to an earlier moment between you, something they had nearly forgotten, and suddenly their unfinished goodbye looked different. They sat down again. This time, instead of finishing the message, they erased an entire paragraph. Then another. And that's when the truth underneath all their hesitation finally surfaced: your soulmate wasn't searching for a reason to leave. They were searching for one undeniable reason to stay. Think about that. How different would everything become if they discovered you had been waiting for clarity too? What if both of you had been protecting yourselves from the same misunderstanding? Their fingers returned to the keyboard, but instead of writing goodbye, they began typing a question. A question they had never dared to ask you directly. And before you assume you know what that question was, stay with the story. Because the words they finally chose revealed that giving up on you was never the decision they truly wanted to make. The question on their screen looked almost too simple for everything it carried. Did I ever really give you the chance to tell me what you wanted? Your soulmate read it once, then again, but their thumb wouldn't touch send. Because suddenly they weren't thinking about the weeks of uncertainty anymore. They were remembering one specific evening when you had tried to say something important and the conversation had ended before either of you reached the truth. At the time, they convinced themselves it meant you were pulling away. Tonight, though, they saw that memory differently. They remembered your hesitation, the unfinished sentence, the strange softness in your voice before everything became quiet. What if you hadn't been trying to create distance at all? What if you had been waiting for them to meet you halfway? That possibility hit harder than anything else they had considered. They opened an older conversation and began reading from the beginning, noticing details they had ignored before, questions you asked, moments when you checked in, little attempts to keep the connection alive when neither of you knew how to speak openly. And then they found something. One message buried between ordinary conversations that suddenly seemed impossible to overlook. You had written that sometimes people become quiet not because they stop caring, but because they don't know whether their feelings are welcome. Your soulmate stared at those words. Their expression softened. "Were you talking about us?" they whispered. And for the first time that night, the possibility of forever walking away no longer felt like strength. It felt like leaving before discovering the answer. But the next discovery made them put the phone down completely. Earlier that day, they had spoken with someone who knew enough about the situation to notice what your soulmate couldn't see from inside it. The conversation hadn't been dramatic. No accusations. No pressure. Just one unexpected question. Have you actually asked them what they feel, or have you been answering for them in your head? Your soulmate hadn't known how to respond. Now those words returned with uncomfortable clarity. How many conclusions had they built from silence? How many times had they interpreted uncertainty as rejection because rejection was easier to prepare for than hope? Stay a little longer, because this is where their decision began changing. Instead of asking whether you deserved another chance, they started asking whether the connection itself had ever received a fair chance. Those are two very different questions. They looked again at the goodbye message they had nearly sent and realized it contained statements about what you supposedly wanted, even though you had never actually said those things. That realization changed the atmosphere in the room. The ending they had spent hours constructing suddenly wasn't certain anymore. If this story speaks to you, you're welcome to share it with someone who might understand that kind of silence. Leave your thoughts in the comments, or subscribe for more stories like this. Because there was still one missing piece your soulmate needed before making any decision, and they knew exactly where to find it. They returned to a conversation from several days earlier and slowly scrolled upward until they reached the moment they remembered. There it was. A sentence from you that they had originally interpreted as hesitation. But tonight they read the sentence before it. Then the one after it. Context changed everything. Your words hadn't sounded like someone preparing to disappear. They sounded like someone asking for patience without knowing how to ask directly. Your soulmate leaned back, almost stunned by how differently the same conversation looked once fear wasn't interpreting every word. But one mystery remained. Why hadn't either of you simply said what you meant? Maybe because sometimes two people can care deeply and still become trapped behind assumptions, timing, pride, and the fear of hearing an answer they aren't ready for. Your soulmate picked up the unfinished goodbye and deleted the final line. Then they deleted the word goodbye itself. What replaced it wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was something far more important: honesty. They began writing about what had confused them, what they had assumed, and what they wished they had asked sooner. But just before sending it, another detail caught their attention, a detail connected to something you had said much earlier, something they suddenly realized might explain your distance completely. Their eyes widened slightly as they reread it. If they were understanding those words correctly now, then you hadn't been quietly letting them go. You might have been waiting for something from them all along. And what your soulmate decided to do with that realization was about to turn this almost goodbye into a conversation neither of you had expected. What stopped your soulmate now wasn't uncertainty, it was one overlooked sentence from you that suddenly seemed to unlock everything. They leaned closer to the screen and read it slowly. You had once said that you couldn't keep reaching towards someone if you weren't sure they wanted you there. At the time, your soulmate had treated those words like a general observation, something you might say when discussing relationships or life. But placed beside everything else tonight, the meaning felt unmistakably personal. Had you been trying to tell them how you felt without risking the vulnerability of saying it directly? Had you been waiting for reassurance while they were waiting for exactly the same thing from you? The irony almost made them laugh, except the emotion behind it was too strong. Two people standing on opposite sides of the same invisible door, each wondering why the other hadn't opened it. Your soulmate looked at the goodbye draft again and finally understood why sending it had felt wrong from the beginning. They weren't ready to lose you. They were exhausted from not knowing whether they mattered to you. And those weren't the same thing. Stay with this moment, because instead of sending the long explanation they had just written, they suddenly erased it. Every carefully constructed paragraph disappeared until the message box was blank again. For a few seconds they simply stared at your name. Then they typed something much shorter: "Can we talk honestly before either of us decides what this means?" Their thumb hovered over the screen. This time there was no dramatic speech waiting behind it, no attempt to predict your answer. There was only a question, and the willingness to finally hear the truth. They pressed send. The tiny confirmation appeared beneath the message, and suddenly the room seemed quieter than before. Your soulmate placed the phone on the table, walked away, returned seconds later, picked it up, then smiled at themselves for being unable to pretend they weren't waiting. But what were they hoping you would say? That you missed them? That everything had been a misunderstanding? Surprisingly, it was something deeper. They wanted clarity, even if clarity required admitting where they had gone wrong. For perhaps the first time, they weren't trying to protect themselves by imagining the ending before it happened. They were giving you space to write your own side of the story. Minutes passed. Then the screen changed. Your message had been seen. Your soulmate's expression froze. No immediate reply came. 5 seconds became 20. 20 became nearly a minute. And strangely, instead of assuming the worst, they remembered what they had just learned about silence. It doesn't always mean rejection. Sometimes silence is someone choosing their words carefully because those words matter. Then the typing indicator appeared. It vanished. Appeared again. Vanished once more. What could you possibly be trying to say that required starting over 3 times? Your soulmate sat completely still now, eyes fixed on the screen. Then your response finally arrived. It wasn't long. But the first sentence made them cover their mouth in disbelief, because you had apparently been carrying one of the exact same fears they had been carrying. And suddenly the distance between you no longer looked like proof that the connection was ending. It looked like evidence that both of you had been afraid of losing something neither of you knew how to define. But there was another line beneath that first sentence, and this was the one your soulmate wasn't prepared for. You explained that there had been a moment when you almost reached out and said everything, but something they had done made you believe they needed space. Your soulmate immediately knew the moment you meant. They remembered becoming unusually distant after an emotional conversation, thinking they were protecting themselves from becoming too invested. You had interpreted that distance as a request to step back. They had interpreted your stepping back as proof you didn't care enough to stay. One reaction had created another until two people who wanted closeness accidentally manufactured distance. Could something so important really have come this close to ending because neither person understood what the other was protecting? Your soulmate's eyes filled with emotion, but their face also carried relief, because at last there was something real to respond to instead of another assumption. They began typing again, slower this time. No games. No hidden meanings. They admitted that they had nearly given up tonight. They admitted why. And then they wrote the sentence they had avoided for far too long. I didn't pull away because I stopped caring. I pulled away because I cared enough to be afraid that I was the only one. Before sending it, they read your message one final time, and noticed something at the bottom that they had somehow missed. You hadn't merely explained your silence. You had asked them a question too. A question about the future. Their eyes stayed fixed on those words, because answering it would require far more than deciding whether to stay or leave. It would require your soulmate to finally reveal what they had secretly wanted from you all along. The question waiting at the bottom of your message was the one your soulmate had secretly wished you would ask, yet seeing it written made everything suddenly real. If we stopped guessing and actually told each other the truth, would you still want to see where this could go? For several seconds, your soulmate didn't type anything. They simply stared at those words while the goodbye message they had almost sent earlier seemed to belong to another version of the evening. Notice what had changed. An hour ago, they believed they had only two choices: keep waiting in uncertainty or walk away forever. Now you had offered a third possibility. Stop interpreting, stop assuming, and finally have the conversation both of you had been avoiding. But could they really become that vulnerable after spending so long protecting themselves? Their fingers moved toward the keyboard, stopped, then moved again. They began with 3 words: yes, I would. Then they deleted them, not because they weren't true, but because 3 words couldn't explain what had been hidden underneath all that distance. They wanted you to understand that they hadn't been searching for perfection. They weren't expecting promises about some flawless future. They simply wanted to know whether the connection mattered enough to both of you to explore honestly. So they wrote again, telling you that if there was still something genuine between you, they didn't want fear making the decision anymore. And then came the admission they had resisted all night. I was ready to give up because I thought losing you slowly would hurt more than leaving first. They stared at that sentence before sending it. Could you understand what they meant? Would you recognize how much feeling had been hiding behind their silence? Then your reply appeared faster than expected, and its opening words changed the entire direction of the conversation. You didn't offer some dramatic promise. Instead, you answered with the kind of honesty your soulmate had needed from the beginning. You explained that you had noticed the distance too, that you had questioned yourself more than once, and that there were moments when you almost decided to stop hoping for anything more. But then you added something your soulmate never expected: you hadn't stayed emotionally connected because you were waiting for a perfect sign. You stayed because certain moments between you had felt too meaningful to dismiss without one honest conversation. Your soulmate leaned back and released a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. There it was. Not certainty about everything ahead, but confirmation that they hadn't imagined the connection alone. And sometimes that is enough to change the next decision. They began exchanging messages differently now. Questions replaced assumptions. Answers replaced carefully guarded hints. Even the pauses felt different because neither person was using silence as evidence anymore. If you've ever watched two people nearly lose something meaningful simply because neither knew what the other was thinking, you're welcome to share this story. Leave your perspective in the comments, and subscribe if you'd like to continue with these emotional journeys. Because the most important moment still hadn't arrived. Your soulmate suddenly asked you something much more specific than anything before. When did you first realize this wasn't ordinary for you? And when your answer came, it pointed directly toward a memory they had carried privately too. It was the same day. The same conversation. Even the same tiny moment neither of you had ever mentioned afterward. You described remembering the way everything around you seemed to disappear during one completely ordinary exchange. The background noise, the people nearby, the distractions, because something about your soulmate's expression had made you realize you cared about what happened next. Your soulmate read the message twice, stunned, because that was precisely when their own feelings had shifted. They remembered going home afterward and replaying the conversation, wondering why something so simple had stayed with them. Neither of you had said anything extraordinary that day. There had been no grand confession. Yet somehow both of you had independently marked the same moment as the beginning of something different. What were the chances that both people had remembered it while believing the other had forgotten? Your soulmate smiled at the screen, and for the first time that evening there was no goodbye draft waiting behind the conversation. It had been deleted completely. But they weren't rushing toward a fantasy ending either. Instead, they suggested something far more meaningful. A real conversation, without coded messages, without testing each other, without pretending not to care. Then they made one final admission before setting the phone down. Tonight I thought I needed to let you go. Now I think what I actually needed was the courage to ask you the truth. But seconds later, your response appeared with a detail that changed their expression again. You agreed to the conversation. But you also revealed there was something important you had deliberately kept from them until you knew whether they still wanted to stay. Your soulmate slowly picked the phone back up. The almost goodbye had been stopped. The misunderstanding had finally cracked open. But now one unanswered truth remained between you, and whatever you were about to reveal could explain why this connection had been so difficult to understand from the very